Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Jennifer Sarah, the Global Director for the World Bank's Water Global Practice. I'm delighted to be here and offer a big and warm welcome to everyone, and a big thank you to the organizers for convening this conference and this session on migration. We are really delighted to be able to share the findings of a flagship report that we prepared on water and migration called Ebb and Flow, and it was launched last August. And the report has 2 volumes that we will share with you today. Volume 1 is Water Migration Development, provides the first ever global analysis of the link between water and migration and the implications for economic development. And the second volume zooms in a bit more closely into the Middle East and North Africa and looks at water in the shadow of conflict. And that focuses on water and forced displacement and conflict in that region. We are also honored to have a distinguished panel to discuss the findings of the report, and more importantly, to link water and migration. And we know that today, migration is big news, big enough to be one of the most discussed topics in political discourse around the world. And that's not surprising, as throughout human history, migration has been foundational to development. So this report brings a water lens to migration and explores water's contribution to this foundational development driver that continues to shape our world. Exploring the relationship between water, migration, and development becomes even more salient as climate change is increasingly adding stresses to the water cycle. So this report tackles the here and now and examines the role that droughts, floods, infrastructure, and other water-related factors have played in determining people's movements. Unfortunately, the framings of migration often fluctuate from a problem to a solution. As the saying goes, the devil really is in the detail. And this report unpacks the nuances that can help us understand the consequences of water availability on human movement, and it presents evidence in many ways to examine the why, who, where, and what of water migration. It is reports like these that help shape the World Bank's operational program, because we really believe in the importance of evidence-based policy advice as we put knowledge into implementation at the country level. So this report highlights policy priorities that are central to the World Bank's mission of supporting poverty reduction and sustainable and inclusive development. We are very, very lucky to have a great and diverse panel of thinkers to discuss the report. We have a poet, an economist, and a political scientist. We will slightly adjust the order. We'll have a 2-part report. The author of the global report, Isha Zaveri, will present the global report. We will then have our economists kick off, Richard Damania, with some commentary, come back with Anders presenting the report on the Middle East and North Africa, and then be able to have our esteemed panelists come in for the final section. So let me turn it over to you, Isha, for the presentation of the global report. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I will start to share my slides. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to present the key findings of our report, Ebb and Flow. If you can see it on the screen, you can download it at the link that you can find there. And I had the immense privilege of working with a real fantastic team of co-authors to produce this 2-volume feat: Jason Russ, Eduardo Borgomeo, Amjad Khan, Anders Jakkerskog, and Richard Damania, who are also here today. So I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you a very quick summary of volume 1. So as Jennifer said, migration is big news. It has shaped and carries on reshaping our world in myriad ways. And the numbers are staggering and speak for themselves. Currently, there are over 1 billion migrants in the world. But what you may not know is that approximately 3/4 are migrants who move within their country's national borders. And water really has the power to shape these migration patterns, perhaps more than you think. And this is really the thesis of this report. Rains, rivers, coasts, and seas have always determined where people have settled. And even today's satellite images at night show you how the bright city lights illuminate the Nile River Valley and Delta that you see on the screen here. With climate change, understanding how water influences migration and development has become even more important. According to some estimates, by the end of the century, 2/3 of the Earth's land is already on track to lose water. But the impacts of climate change are not some threat on the distant horizon. They are happening here and now. And so what we do in Ebb and Flow is look back into the recent past and take the intensifying growing water scarcity together with water variability that we're already witnessing and explore the impacts on internal migration and development by asking 3 questions. Well, the first obvious question to ask is why? Why and in what context do water shocks impact migration? The next question we asked is who migrates due to water shocks, since people are central to this? And finally, what are the impacts and where do they occur? But before turning to the why, who, and where, a more fundamental question must be asked, which is how much of a role does water even play in global migration? In particular, what is the role of the rainfall shocks and the droughts that I've just described? And to do so, we harness the power of machine learning and big data. And we employed the largest data set on internal migration ever assembled from over 400 million individuals from 189 different population censuses in 64 countries between 1960 and 2015, spanning 55 years. So what did we learn? We learned that in addition to the traditional demographic drivers of migration, periods of rainfall deficit are also significant predictors of population movements within countries around the world. But there is a big but. The but is that there is the range of influence can vary considerably, and there is a lot of variation across countries and regions. And so this really should caution against making sweeping conclusions. So now that we have this 10,000-foot view with the machine learning analysis, let's dig deeper into the data and evidence to understand what's happening on the ground. And to do so, several national and global level data sets were combined, such as global precipitation data covering the extent of the 20th and 21st centuries, data sets that link cities to their water sources, spatially disaggregated data on local migration rates, household surveys, government censuses, and data on nighttime lights to track economic activity. So what did we find? Let's turn to this first question of why. Why, in what context do water shocks impact migration? Well, if I were to ask you, why did you migrate? This most straightforward question you will find is perhaps the hardest to answer. Every migrant has a unique story and experience, and people's choices to move or to stay, they occur within the context of a wide array of personal, social, cultural, and other macro considerations. But at its economic core, the decision boils down to 2 salient questions. First, will I be better off in the long run if I choose to migrate? And 2, do I have the means to migrate? What we find in the report is that to avoid the ravages of drought, some people do decide to move away, and migration can act as a release valve when droughts induce income shocks. In fact, rainfall-induced water deficits result in 5 times as much migration as water excess. But there are important nuances in why and when this migration occurs. Not everyone has the option to move. When there is extreme poverty and migration is costly, repeated droughts can stress household finances even further, leaving people with fewer resources to recover or move for jobs. The poorest are in fact 4 times less likely to be able to move than higher income residents. And these populations who are left behind are often hidden from media headlines, yet they represent a policy concern that is just as serious. So how can we respond? How can we protect livelihoods at the sources that largely happen to be rural areas? Well, broadly, the choice of policies fall into 3 buckets. Water storage and supplemental irrigation through physical infrastructure, for example, if weighed carefully to avoid unintended consequences, they can buffer vulnerable rural communities from water variability and scarcity. Climate-smart agriculture and farmer-led irrigation can also play similar roles while minimizing the environmental footprint. But alongside this physical infrastructure, we also have natural capital and green infrastructure, such as watersheds and their associated forests, that can enhance the resilience and quality of water supplies, and they can also provide drought-proof sources of income to the poor. So investing in their preservation can really provide long-term benefits. But despite these solutions, inevitably some residual risks will remain. And therefore, adaptive safety nets are critical as a last backstop to prevent severe deprivation when water shocks hit. So let's turn to this second question of who. As we just saw, droughts can trap poor people in low-income countries, but they do tend to induce migration in middle-income countries. And in these places, water shocks affect not only the number of people who move, but also the skills they bring with them. And because of that, the movement of people is really the movement of human capital. And this movement of human capital is the key channel through which migration shapes regional development. For example, high-skilled workers, they tend to move to more productive regions to earn higher wages. What we find in the report is that workers who are pushed into cities and are escaping droughts, they usually possess lower education levels and skills than other migrant workers. And this means they face lower wages and a wage gap of up to 3.4% when they arrive at the destination. And this evidence we find across multiple middle-income countries. Not only do these migrants face lower wages, but in turn, they also have poorer access to housing and basic services. So what can be done? Even as these migrants may be better off because migration has allowed them to adapt to the risks of water variability in the absence of other options, there are still several fundamental ingredients that are needed for migrant integration. So for example, no regret policies like building human capital and investing in worker productivity through education. These can act as portable assets that can move with people wherever they go. We also need to invest in basic services like water supply and sanitation and safe housing for poor migrants in urban areas. And finally, alongside these investments in worker education, active labor market policies that build skills are also needed to enable migrants to find the best opportunities. So cities are the destination of most internal migrants, but cities are not immune to water shocks. In fact, high-profile urban droughts in Cape Town and Sao Paulo and Chennai, they show us that some of the world's megacities are increasingly facing day zero events when water supplies become really low. But dozens of smaller cities across the globe also face day zero type events, but they don't always make international headlines. And this map shows you these cities, big and small. The larger the dot, the larger and more sustained the deficit. And as you can see, cities with big deficits are spread out throughout much of the developing world. So what we find is that such water shortages can significantly slow urban growth and can in turn compound the vulnerability of migrants. If you turn your gaze to the chart, you will see that as the dry water shock magnitude increases from left to right, city growth shown in the black line also declines linearly and steadily. And it can decline by up to 12%, in turn reducing the quality of life for residents and recent migrants alike. So paradoxically, migrants might trade one bad situation for another. So how can we preserve and sustain water resources in cities? Adaptation to the day zero type events that I just described, they can be expensive. And so we have to carefully weigh the options available. Although in some cases, supply expansion will be critical, truly solving the problem in the long term needs demand management. And this will include both scarcity pricing of water, as well as technological solutions that reduce water use within homes and businesses. Adaptive water reallocation that allows emergency transfers of water when needed may also offer another solution to ensure against severe drought. And finally, better urban planning is sorely needed. For example, recycling wastewater, harvesting stormwater. These can provide alternative water supplies that can have environmental benefits. And if cities were reimagined and redesigned to resemble sponges, they could capture and soak runoff and store water below ground for future use. So these innovative designs can help improve urban water security as well as build resilience to climate change. So the policy option ahead of us is, or rather the challenge ahead of us is, how can we turn these water crises of today into opportunities for building resilience? And context really matters, but the menu of options that I have just described, they broadly follow the principles of the 3 Ps, which is protect livelihoods in the origin, provide people-centered investments, and preserve and sustain water resources in the destination. You can think of these policies like a chain of policies that are linked to each other, starting from managing water right from the water source itself, and then across this rural-urban continuum from the farms to the cities where most migrants move to. And along this chain of policies and at the heart of it are the ebb and flow of people. And it is for this reason that policies that focus on reducing water risks and the impacts of these risks must be complemented by strategies that also broaden opportunities and build the long-term resilience of communities. Because doing so will give people more agency to determine the best outcome for themselves, not just to survive, but thrive wherever they may choose to locate. So with that, let me end and thank you so much. Over to you, Jennifer.
So Asha, thank you. That was incredible in such a short period of time, how much information you've given us. It's an incredibly impressive report, the amount of data, the evidence, and also the policy suggestions that you make. So I'd like to turn to Richard as a commentator, and Richard Damania is the chief economist of the Sustainable Development Practice Group at the World Bank. You also contributed to the report, but I'd be very curious to hear from you a bit more, is that the report shows that some people face a triple jeopardy. It's exposure to high climate risks, reduced economic opportunities, and the inability to move. And so in such cases, what would you think, what is your advice? And should governments continue in investing in high climate risk areas or provide incentives to move? Should we build back better? Should we build elsewhere? Should we invest in people or in places? Aisha gave a series of possible solutions, and I'd like to hear a little bit more. How can governments and the World Bank think about the trade-offs and the decisions around these points? So over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, Isha, for a very clear and thought-provoking presentation. Yes, that is a very difficult question that you've put forward, Jennifer. So we know that there's going to be, as we go forward with climate change, by about 2030, about 70% of the extreme poor are going to live in areas most impacted by climate change, which are near the equator. The pressures to move are already here and now, and they will get an awful lot worse. To fix ideas, if we think, for example, of the Sahel, where we have expanding deserts, worsening agronomic conditions, and high population growth. Very little economic opportunity. What should governments do? Do they invest in places hit by worsening conditions? Or do they invest in people who live in those places? It is very tempting for us to argue that what we should do is to create the enabling conditions. If we build roads, bridges, seawalls, we keep people safe, we make them productive, and we provide economic opportunities. But of course, there's another side to this very same story, as we've learned. We've learned that there are downside risks. There are risks of elite capture. When we invest in bridges and canals, land values rise, and it is the rich who capture the value. There is also the risk that we lock people into places with no realistic economic prospects. And there is a further risk that we lock people into places with rising danger. And we see that all the time. Places get flooded and people move back exactly to where they were flooded. A few years later, as night follows day, the flood returns and the problems re-emerge. And this is why many people argue that in places where you have very high climate risk, investments should be people-based rather than place-based. If they're people-based, this allows people to make choices, whether they move or they don't move, whether they create opportunities where they are or they don't. So I think one of the key issues really is determining how great the risks actually are if the places have productive potential, and then deciding on whether policies should be people-based or place-based. There's another aspect to it that Isha actually touched upon. It's not only the policy at the source, but it's also the policy at the destination where the migrants go that we need to be enormously worried. You know, why is it that in some places, so many places indeed, migrants are treated with enormous hostility, whereas in other places, the response is a little bit more benign and very occasionally, very occasionally, regrettably, even a little welcoming. And let me just share a little anecdote with you that might cast some light on this. To take a concrete example, between 2015 and 2017, about 3 million refugees arrived in Europe. That's roughly about 0.4% of the population of the receiving countries, way under 1%. Over the same period, Uganda absorbs 1.5 million refugees. That's over 3% of Uganda's population. In Uganda, the integration is smooth. In Europe, the places more exposed to migrants turned more hostile towards them. Why? What's so different? One of the things that economic research seems to find is that in developing countries, the migrants very often will provide an economic boost, especially if you get a refugee camp, which brings an influx of jobs, workers, economic activities, and bang, there are economic benefits. The flip side is when host populations perceive migrants as a burden, an economic burden, you will get hostility. So we need to look not only at policies at the source, but policies at the destination, not just for the newcomers, but also how they are perceived by the host populations. But simply, the laissez-faire approach will not work in this context. Thanks so much. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard. And you brought it really back to current events and the reality, the examples you've given from Europe and Uganda. And we're looking at the newspaper today about even Belarus, encouraging migration, as a throughway into Europe. So this is a very real conversation. Do you invest in people or places? And, you have to look at where people are leaving from and where they're going to. You also mentioned rising dangers. And when you mention rising dangers, I think you're referring more to repeated floods and droughts. But I think this is a good transition actually to ask Anders to talk about the rising dangers and conflict, because he did in the volume 2 of Ebb and Flow was really to drill down a little bit in the Middle East and North Africa to understand the linkages between migration, conflict, and water. So thank you, Richard. I know you need to go. Appreciate your participation. I'm going to ask Anders if you could also please go ahead and present the findings of your report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm going to start the presentation now. And as Jennifer was saying, this part of the report, volume 2, that is, focuses on Middle East and North Africa. And MENA is, as you're well aware, the poster child, unfortunately, of water scarcity, migration, and wars and conflict. And it's in that vein where we're trying to understand also how this affects the nexus between water and migration. And the focus here, I'd like to highlight that is on people who are forcibly displaced, people that have to leave their home either to move somewhere within the countries or even crossing an international border, making them refugees. And you may not know the exact figures, but these are some of the figures from the region. 7.2 million refugees, 2.7 of those hosted in the region, often most of them in Jordan and in Lebanon, who is another example of, at least to some extent, where following on what Richard was saying, where the welcome is a little bit more benign than perhaps it has been in other places. And you have then, in addition to that, 12.4 million internally displaced, also fleeing from armed conflict. The questions are not exactly the same for this volume, but they have touch points. And really what we're looking at here are basically three questions also, or three buckets, if you like. Water as a driver of conflict and cooperation, and why and in what context does water contribute to conflict and forced displacements? The second question revolves around the issue of water as a casualty of conflict. Why and in what context does conflict contribute to water insecurity? And then finally, water as a source of vulnerability. Where do the forcibly displaced people live? And what water risks do they face in these places where they are moving to? You will have read either these or variations of these in newspapers, where researchers are making links between conflict, drought, climate change, and then leading to migration. And I think what we're trying to do in this volume is to bring some nuance to this question, because it's not, and I think Esha highlighted that as well, it's not as simple as that you move for one particular reason. It's complex, and every migrant or refugee has his or her own story. So what we're doing here is suggesting caution in invoking causal relationship that perhaps might be tempting for politicians to make a point, but the reality is, as often, a little bit more complex. First question then, we're looking at the aspect of water and cooperation and conflict. And you can see here, both at the international level, as well as the domestic level, most of the interactions relating to water are either cooperative or neutral, and fewer than perhaps you would expect are conflictive, and these are figures from the MENA region. And of course, this is not necessarily what you read about in the press. You read about disagreements, you read about conflict over water, you have probably heard about the discussions of the next reason for war in the Middle East and North Africa will be over water. Well, again, when you dig deeper into the numbers, it's a little bit more complex and nuanced. And you can have, of course, relations over water both having a bit of conflict and a bit of cooperation at the same time. So that's that, and this data builds on data from the PRIO, Peace Research Institute in Oslo database on the domestic level, as well as the Oregon State University for the international level. And what we see here and what we take with us is that water can actually bring people together at the national level, but also at the international level, transboundary level. Moving on then to looking at water as a casualty of conflict. You will probably have heard also about, particularly in case of Syria, targeting of water infrastructure, whether it's water supply and sanitation assets or wastewater treatment plants. They have gone up significantly over the last 5-6 years. And it's sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional, so-called collateral damage. But what we've seen is unfortunate and increasing and alarming trend of this being the case in the MENA region, not only in Syria but also in Yemen and Libya. And these figures build on the database that the Duke University have developed and help us understand and highlight this issue even more. Then finally, water as a source of vulnerability. Where do the forcibly displaced people live and what water risks do they face? I mean, we have chosen to divide it into 3 buckets, which would cover most of what we're talking about here. They either end up in camps, in cities and informal settlements in the country of origin, so-called IDPs, or cities and informal settlements in country of arrival, then they are refugees. And I'd like to highlight here, because one understanding one may have just reading about the news, you see pictures from refugee camps, and one may make the assumption that most of the refugees or the internally displaced live in refugee camps. But if you take a country like Jordan, only about 20% of the people that arrive from another country live in a refugee camp. And then about 80%, they live in either cities or informal settlements, either in the city or on the outskirts of the city or in villages. So that is also something we need to keep in mind when we're trying to address these issues, both at the country level, but also as an international institution. What can we do to support countries that are receiving refugees, and also the countries that have them internally displaced? And what are the risks that the refugees face? If you look at camps, there will be flash floods. There is, we're moving into that now soon. There will be a lot of often snow and freezing temperatures in many of these refugee camps, whether in Syria, or in Jordan, or in Lebanon. There are also challenges, of course, for the vulnerable people, the disadvantaged. Apart from being a refugee, people with disabilities, or also often women and girls, face higher risks relating to the access to water and sanitation services that are either not set up for them to work, or they face risks because they have to move from one place in the refugee camp to another, which may involve additional dangers for their own safety. If you look on Yemen, and these figures speaks for themselves really, but about 18 million people do not have safe access to water. 25% of the displaced people in Syria share their sanitation facility with at least 6 people. And in Libya, 50% of the municipalities, in 50%, the forcibly displaced cannot afford simply to pay for the water that they need. Then looking into further figures here, they face the risks that many of the regular citizens face as well, but it's at a ramped up scale. Contaminated drinking water is a challenge for Syrian households in Lebanon. Most of the refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan, face water and sanitation risks, even if a country like Jordan have put in place many measures to address and help this situation. On top of this, we also have the fact that climate change, as other speakers have already said, it's here and now, and it will increase, not least in the Middle East and North Africa region. And based on earlier reports, not this report, but the World Bank has undertaken, shows that unless things and measures are taken already now, water scarcity that are climate change induced could reduce economies by 5 to 6% in the region. And that's a major challenge. And demand for labor could also drop by more than 10%. That is because largely agricultural fields craves water, obviously, for either irrigation or also rain-fed irrigation. And when climate change comes and variability will increase, the availability to actually grow the crops will increase, and that will lead to less demand for labor. What we're also seeing here is, of course, the changing nature of conflict, and you've seen it in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya. the nature is different today. It's not between military actors necessarily. It's involving civilians, it's involving militias. It often takes place in highly populated areas such as Aleppo in Syria. And there is a blurring between the civilian and the military lines. And what we also see is that conflicts are protracted. It's not a clear start of the conflict. It's not a clear ending, unfortunately, of the conflict. So they tend to drag on, and that's something we need to take into account as well. This is all a relatively bleak picture I'm painting here, but we also do see opportunities to build a resilience if the right measures are undertaken. And I won't dwell very much on the detail here. It's similar to what Isha was highlighting for volume 1. What we need to see are interventions on the whole scale, if you like. It's not enough to put in place building blocks at the national level, institution, etc., that would function at the national level, unless you also combine that with people and area-based interventions that actually address the immediate risks and challenges that refugees, the internally displaced, face on a daily basis. Because if you don't have that in place, the national building blocks will be much less efficient and sort of undermine the social contract between either the government or the hosting country and the people. But you also need, in addition to this, a regional perspective to help prevent these conflicts, of course, and spur development. And also there's an opportunity to increase the cooperation between the countries, not only on water, but importantly on water. More transboundary cooperation can alleviate at least some of these pressures and flashpoints that are already here and may increase in the future. Finally, from a policy perspective, and what the decision makers needs to take into account, and it's hard trade-offs that they are facing. But if you look at and what we learn in the report is that there is a need to work much more closely between development actors such as the World Bank supporting countries and humanitarian actors and even security actors, because unless that sort of closer cooperation is happening, then there is the risk that development actors think within their silo, and similarly for humanitarian actors. But if there is more coordination and collaboration going on already here and now in terms of coordination and understanding each other's interventions and approaches, much more can be achieved if there is a conflict. If ICRC, for example, which the World Bank is already collaborating with and trying to collaborate more with, knows what the development efforts have been, because then they can respond, and that will also help a preparation and for recovery and return of refugees and internally displaced. Jennifer, I will end here and hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anders. That was a really comprehensive presentation in a very short period of time. A couple of very striking thoughts that you said. That water is more often related to cooperation than conflict, which might be counterintuitive, but I much appreciate the fact that you've put a human face on this. You know, behind every single refugee is a human being, and either living in camps or not living in camps, and the really the challenges being faced at the human level. Moving to the next part of our conversation, I'm really delighted to introduce two panelists. The first is Mara Daoudi, who is the Associate Professor of International Relations at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the Saif Gobash Chair in Arab Studies at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And we also have Ruth Padel, who is an award-winning poet, a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, professor of poetry at King's College in London. Wonderful to have both of you here. And I want to start with Ruth. You've pondered questions about migration through your books and your poetry. Your book, We Are All From Somewhere Else, first published as The Mara Crossing, a metaphor for how difficult the crossing to another place is a beautiful mediation on migration that is also quoted in volume 1 of Ebb and Flow. It reflects the complexities between staying and going in vivid poetry and prose. The report also demonstrates that the decision to migrate is very complex and nuanced, as Isha explained to us. So how can such evidence contribute to the societal debate on migration, which is often emotionally charged and politically divisive? What does it mean for the way in which we think about these issues in the media and the arts and public discourse? So over to you, Ruth, to share your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Well, it's fascinating to hear it all. And when I began this was in 2006. And so, of course, the population of migration across the globe has grown exponentially since then. And one of the arguments in my book is that migration is natural to our planet. Migration made the world globally. I mean, we all came from either outer space, that's how the first life cell got here, or from under the sea. And what happened is it spread, and that's migration. So we were made by migration. And of course, human civilization was made by migration when, out of Africa. But also I spent a lot of time studying other life forms, because as well as the cells in our body, our cells in our body migrate to create a fetus or migrate to ward off infection. So in the system of the world and of our bodies, migration happens for two reasons: to protect the organism or to make it grow, which seems to be in line with the aims of the World Bank, development and protection. And I sort of followed the birds, the whales, the jellyfish, the wildebeest across the Mara Plain, because I wanted to understand what the dangers of the journey are and why they're doing it once I got to people. And I think, listening both to Isha and to Anders, in my book, there are two overriding groupings of reason to migrate. One is the push and one is the pull. And so the push is when the place you are living in gets absolutely uninhabitable for whatever reason. So it might be to do with war, of course, or it's going to do with the natural disasters, and water is a big part of that. And in the first poem, I thought I'd just read a tiny little bit of the first poem, which is called Time to Fly, which is a kind of litany for reasons that any life form migrates. And this little bit is on people. You go because you have 17 children and the Lord will provide, because your 16 brothers have parceled up the land and there's none left for you. You go because the waters are rising, an ice sheet is melting, the rivers are dry, there are no more fish in the sea. But the poem ends with the image of this. You go because hope, need, and escape are names for the same God. And I think hope is the other side. Hope and home are the two other sides, are the faces of the crystal of migration in a way. And one thing that I felt was so important, and both Isha and Anders in different ways touched on it, is thinking about the host, the receiving communities and populations. And I think absolutely crucial in that is education, and education of the humanities. So I'm not talking now about all the things. I loved Isha's image of making the cities like a sponge. I don't know quite how you would like to do that, but also to make them porous to education and compassion. And when I was doing the research, I was quite shocked with some of the sort of comments on migration stories from my own country, say to the Sunday Times or something, people saying, well, they should go back to their own country about a shipwreck or something like that. And really the sense of how can you get a host nation to have compassion? And I'm thinking about Greek tragedy, which is saying a lot of this at the beginning. There's a wonderful passage in a play by Sophocles on Ajax. Ajax is mad. He is very unhappy. He has been made mad by a goddess, and he thinks that he is torturing and killing his enemy Odysseus. And the goddess shows Odysseus Ajax mad and says, see, how great the power of the gods is. And Odysseus says, I pity him, although he is my enemy. And looking at him, I look at my own case as much as him. And I see we are, all we who live, just images and an empty shadow. And Aristotle says, when you watch a tragedy, you feel pity and fear. And you feel pity because the person is in a bad state. We see migrants in the sea. We see people coming over here desperate. But we also should fear because we are human beings like them. And I think that the more that the humanities can be taught and addressed, instead of the pushbacks that our country lamentably is now investing in, instead of the pushbacks, there should be education in compassion and openness. I mean, I don't think that's my sort of big pitch. And I was one of the places that I've been involved in is Lesbos in Greece. One small island actually encapsulates in microcosm so much of the problems of sharing resources, which is in the largest senses, which is what water is about. When the Syrian migrants first came and thousands washed up on the seas in 2015, the Lesbos Islanders were so welcoming, the natural Greek hospitality, they rushed to the shores, they pulled them out, they gave them blankets, they gave them phone chargers, they helped. But 6 years on, it's much harder. The process hasn't been smooth at all. Things have gone from bad to worse. Olive trees are cut down, the dogs and the goats are eaten and killed. So there's much more resentment now. And so it's got to be a two-prong approach of understanding the resources, all the things you're talking about, and the infrastructure, investing in the place and investing in the people, but also investing in the education and support of the host population.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I mean, it's just wonderful how you can put beautiful words and poetry into such a difficult topic, and the importance of compassion and understanding. So thank you for that, because I think that's what we all really, really need. And the example of Lesbos is a very good one. It's real. And it comes back also to resources, which is a lot what these studies are about as well, natural resources and human. But let me turn over to Marwa and focus a bit more on volume 2 on the Middle East and North Africa. And it discusses how water infrastructure in the region is often targeted and destroyed during conflicts. And Anders just gave an example of, Syria, but we have it in Yemen. It's actually quite tragic. But what are the long-term implications of infrastructure targeting for rebuilding states and sustaining livelihoods? What ideas do you have on actions that international partners can take to reduce the impact of infrastructure targeting on livelihoods and economies? Over to you, Marwa. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a bit hard to follow on such an inspirational reflection on migration and human suffering in the end. So when we think about conflicts and the targeting of infrastructures, we're thinking about civilian infrastructure. So this is an added layer to the vulnerability and the suffering of the local populations. In addition to being forced to migrate, they don't take the decision to migrate very easily, as we all know, and they are being seen as a security threat by some of the hosting countries, very unfortunately. And I was very struck by Esha's comment that in the developing world, they are welcome because they're seen as assets and they're contributing to the prosperity and the jobs. Whereas it was Richard's, I think, argument, yes. Whereas the wealthy countries tend to refuse them and reject them and see them as security threats. When it comes to conflicts, civilians are the primary victims of these infrastructures and the targeting of infrastructures. And I think we have in the report presented by Anders as well, this idea of water as a casualty of conflicts. Clearly, dams are targeted, pipelines, and then in the end, it's cutting the access of civilian populations to safe, clean water resources. It's also creating contamination. We have oil spills which go to groundwater, and there's a myriad of consequences that one doesn't immediately realize when we look at infrastructure targeting. And of course, first I want to say it's also weaponized by states, but also non-state actors. For example, cutting the flow, flooding or threatening to flood populations is a very effective military strategy in conflicts. And we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in Israel's targeting of Gaza and South Lebanon in past years. This has been a very effective weapon by states, but also non-state actors. We've seen recently ISIS, for example, capturing large dams in Syria and Iraq and leveling itself as a very threatening interlocutor through water resources, through the targeting of the infrastructures. So I want to say the myriad of consequences for civilians against, because this is our primary concern here, is water insecurity, but also food insecurity, groundwater contamination, also the issue of toxic rubbles. We often forget when dams are targeted and collapse. There are also industrial materials, when there are also medical hazards which are within those toxic rubbles. This is a generational issue as well for the civilians. And of course, mass displacements. When populations are not able to access safe water resources, they migrate to seek, livelihoods. So I think what could the international community do? Clearly, focus on the fact and develop norms. And I know there's been efforts, for example, through the Geneva Water Hub and other civilian efforts to state that civilian infrastructures are red lines in conflicts. They should never be targeted. They should be out of the military conflicts, and civilian access to safe water resources and natural resources in general should also be guaranteed and secured in conflicts. Now, we know with international law, it's enforced or not, and it depending on the power of who wants the norm to be enforced or not. But if we have it as a customary rule, that would also bring, in terms of humanitarian interventions and international intervention, some standards and guidelines which would prevent states firsthand, because states are liable to the international community, and force also violent non-state actors, force them away from these civilian infrastructures by guaranteeing internationally the protection of those civilian infrastructures and the access of civilian populations. And I think we come back here to the issue of human suffering and human vulnerability, which is at the heart of our discussion also in that panel as well.
So Mara, thank you so much for that. It is, are there rules for war is a bigger question, but like we say, it's the link between water and food insecurity and health. And thank you for mentioning the Geneva Water Hub and a lot of work on the blue peace, blue diplomacy, how important that is. We're running out of time, but I really have a final question, and it's linked to the topic of the Cassandra Conference, which is such a wonderful conference. And I would like to quote Leonardo da Vinci, who once said, "Knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do." So from each of you, from your vantage point, how can we translate the concern for and knowledge of some of the most foundational issues of our times, like change of climate, environmental degradation, human mobility? What can we do to take action? Just really quickly, your final thoughts on that. I'll start with Ruth, and then Marwa, and I'll ask Anders and Nisha each to give a 1 minute. What are your final ideas on how can we take action and move this agenda forward?
I think, no poem ever stopped a tank. No poem ever built a dam. So poetry can only have an indirect, but it can have an inspirational effect. And I think that's where I put my marker is on education, and the education in the humanities, and the value of making people understand the other through art.
Thank you, Ruth. Over to you, Mara.
I agree. I think the power of words, the power of knowledge, disseminating knowledge, that's what we're doing today, trying to show through your report how important it is to focus on the individual level, the community level, how it's perceived. Migrants are not a threat, they're an asset, they bring human capital. And also to think that through education, and I agree with Ruth, it's very important at all levels, the awareness that we're in it, all of us, and it's a collective action, issue. And although the COP26 was a bit disheartening as a result, still there should be some action, mobilized, awareness diffused, and the power of word and knowledge, in my view, is very important in that sense.
Thank you, Mara. Anders, and then Isha, you get the last word.
Thank you very much. And fascinating to listen to the panelists. I just need to say that. So along the same lines, I think what we can do is to work on advocacy, really trying to bring out the sort of the facts-based and research that we're trying to do. And I think it's even more important in trying to build awareness in this, if I'm allowed to say, sort of post-truth era that we seem to find ourselves in. So I think that's what I would say as where we can contribute. Over.
Okay, thank you, Isha.
Well, it's been such a privilege and honor to hear all of these diverse voices. And I think that's why we wanted this panel to have a diversity of voices. And that's what we need in the migration debate as well. I would say that I think, as both our reports, I think Volume 1 and Volume 2, both show that the challenge is really to recognize the complexity of migration, but also to acknowledge that the ebb and flow of people, like the title of our report shows, the ebb and flow of people always in search of water, it binds the future of all of us, both in the rural as well as in the urban and everything in between. So that would be my last message.
So thank you so much. And I wish we could continue because this is just absolutely fascinating. But I do want to thank all of our distinguished panel members and for those of you who are attending. I'm going to remember, Ruth, that every single cell in my body is a migrant because I think that's what it is. And it is all about our common humanity coming together. We're all migrants. We're children of migrants. Our children will be migrants. And we're just one here together in the world together. So thank you all so much. And I look forward to maybe having another opportunity to meet.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.